Welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today because we are going to uncover something genuinely magical. You know, when we read a great novel or a captivating poem, we usually just get totally swept up in the emotion and the plot. But beneath those words, there lies a hidden, completely invisible architecture. Today, we're exploring discourse analysis in stylistics to reveal exactly how that architecture is built.
I want to start by throwing a fundamental question your way. What actually makes a text a text? Think about it for a second. If I just read you a random string of dictionary definitions, that's not a story, right? So how does a sequence of individual, totally isolated sentences suddenly transform into a unified, living, breathing narrative that completely pulls you in? To figure that out, we have to look way above the individual sentences.
And that brings us to the core principle of our explainer today, discourse. In stylistics, discourse analysis is simply the study of language above the sentence level. We aren't just looking at the grammar of one single sentence anymore, we're studying how entire texts are organized as unified communicative wholes. Meaning doesn't just live in isolated words, it emerges from these intricate, beautiful patterns of connection that span the length of an entire text. It's like a giant puzzle coming together.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, above the sentence. Second, textuality, making a text. Third, cohesion, the linguistic surface. Fourth, coherence, the reader's interpretation. Fifth, clause relations and patterns. And finally, number 6, the unified literary experience. Let's jump right in.
Okay, let's dive into this and look at the massive shift from analyzing single, isolated clauses to analyzing extended communicative wholes.
Section 2, textuality, making a text.
For a long time, linguistic analysis was basically stuck under a microscope, focusing heavily on the single clause, where the noun goes, where the verb sits. But literature operates on a much grander scale. When we shift our analytical frame upward, we encounter textuality. These are the specific properties that distinguish an actual, functional text from a completely random sequence of words. It is literally the DNA of communication. Now, linguists Beaugrand and Dressler identified 7 standards of textuality, including things like intentionality and acceptability. But for our explainer today, we are going to laser focus on the 2 absolute heroes of our story, cohesion and coherence.
It's absolutely crucial to separate these 2 concepts. Cohesion is all about the explicit linguistic surface. It's the tangible stuff, the actual words, the pronouns, and the grammar used to stitch sentences together. Coherence, on the other hand, well, that happens entirely in your head. It's the reader's interpretation, the underlying semantic unity. To put that into perspective, a text can be perfectly cohesive grammatically, but make absolutely no logical sense, meaning it lacks coherence. Or it can lack explicit cohesive surface ties completely, but still achieve massive coherence because you, the reader, connect the dots.
Section 3, cohesion, the linguistic surface.
Let's start with the physical building blocks, the specific toolkit authors use to weave sentences together so you intuitively know how one thought leads to the next. Take a listen to this excerpt. A young woman entered the station. She was carrying a small case. It was brown and worn at the corners. She set it down carefully by the platform bench and sat beside it. That's 4 separate sentences, but you naturally read it as one continuous scene rather than a robotic list of facts. Why? Because of cohesive reference ties.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how we can visibly map it out. Step 1 introduces a new referent, a young woman. Step 2 uses she, which is an anaphoric pronoun pointing directly back to the woman. Step 3 introduces a small case. Step 4 uses it, pointing right back to the case. This anaphoric reference chain visibly stitches these 4 distinct sentences into a tightly woven, cohesive text. You probably don't even realize it's happening, but this grammar is literally holding your hand through the narrative.
Another major tool for surface cohesion is conjunctions. We've got additive, adversative, causal, temporal, the list goes on. Words like and, but, because, and then. These aren't just filler words. They are the explicit logical and temporal signposts that guide your interpretation. They tell you exactly how the upcoming sentence relates to the one you literally just read.
But hey, grammar isn't the only way to create cohesion. Read this next example with me. The kitchen was quiet in the morning. The silence pressed against the walls. Outside, the empty street waited. Nothing moved. The house held its breath. Notice something different there? There are almost 0 explicit grammatical connectives or pronouns chaining these sentences together. Yet it feels incredibly unified, doesn't it?
That profound unity is achieved through lexical cohesion. This relies entirely on vocabulary rather than grammar. We see reiteration, where quiet is echoed right away by its synonym silence. And we see collocation, words that naturally just belong to the same semantic field. Quiet, silence, nothing moved, held its breath. These semantic fields overlap to create a unified world of frozen stillness, and they do it without using a single explicit grammatical connective. It's just incredibly atmospheric.
Section 4. Coherence. The reader's interpretation.
So if cohesion is the actual words on the page, coherence is the invisible, interactional mind meld between the author's clues and your own inferences. It's how you make the text meaningful. A really fantastic concept for understanding this in literature is isotopy. Isotopy is simply the recurrence of a semantic category across a text that builds a cohesive thematic world. It's the underlying thematic coherence that structures a text's deeper meaning. And this brilliantly illustrates how that works in practice. A poem might have a grief isotopy, repeatedly relying on words related to darkness, cold, absence, and silence. On the flip side, a novel exploring societal decay might rely on a corruption isotopy, using vocabulary completely centered around dirt, contamination, and disease. Notice how, without the author explicitly stating, hey, this is about grief, or this is about corruption, these recurring conceptual categories create massive semantic unity. They guide your interpretation on a totally subconscious level.
Section 5. Clause relations and patterns.
Let's zoom back out for a second and look at the macro-level architecture. We've explored words and sentences. Now let's examine how entire paragraphs and arguments are structured. Take this minimalist example. He left the house at 7. The streets were empty. She was not at the station. Here, the author has deliberately suppressed explicit connections. There's no because or and then. By using juxtaposition, the text relies on implicit clause relations. It forces you, the reader, to actively infer the tragic narrative logic connecting these events. You have to do the work to figure out that he left early to meet her, but those empty streets foreshadowed her absence. This kind of active reading is a hallmark of truly great literature.
Now, scaling up even further, we have entire structural templates known as discourse patterns. These organize massive sections of a text. They are macro-level structures that authors use to guide the overarching flow of information, making sure you know exactly what phase of the communicative journey you're currently in.
Let's move to and see how this builds a very familiar framework, the problem-solution pattern. Phase 1 is the situation, just giving us the background. Phase 2 introduces a problem, some sort of disruption. Phase 3 is the solution, the protagonist's response, and Phase 4 is the evaluation, the final result. Actually, scratch that. It's more than just a pattern. This analytical discourse pattern maps perfectly onto the canonical narrative structure of almost every literary work you have ever read. It's the invisible scaffolding of storytelling itself.
Section 6. The unified literary experience.
So, we've learned all the rules of how texts are glued together, but you know what? The true magic and art of literature often happens when an author decides to totally break those rules. Disrupted cohesion is a powerful stylistic tool called foregrounding. When an author abruptly abandons a cohesive pattern, like breaking a pronoun reference chain, suddenly suppressing explicit conjunctions, or radically shifting perspectives, it is rarely an accident. It's a deliberate stylistic signature used to create suspense, signal psychological intensity, or drastically change the point of view. The architecture shakes, and you, the reader, feel the earthquake.
So the crucial point is summarized perfectly by linguists Leach and Short. The analysis of a literary text is never finished at the sentence level. The meaning of any sentence is constituted partly by its relations to what precedes and follows it. A text is always, always greater than the sum of its individual sentences. It is a fully unified, deeply woven communicative experience.
I want to leave you with this final question to think about. How does the next book you read connect its parts? The very next time you sit down with a great novel, I challenge you to look for that invisible architecture. Look for those pronoun chains, the lexical fields, the implicit gaps the author desperately wants you to fill. I promise you, once you start seeing the matrix of discourse analysis, your appreciation for your favorite literature will never, ever be the same. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.